And suddenly, it wasn't just the officer who had to answer for his actions. Now, the general was in the spotlight, and the truth that was about to come out could change everything. The moment stretched, heavy with anticipation. The officer, now fully realizing his mistake, opened his mouth again, but the words wouldn't come. The general didn't look at him anymore. His eyes were on the crowd, on the young man who had just spoken. The people weren't just focused on what had happened tonight. They were focused on him now, on something from his past that none of them had expected to surface. The young man took a step forward, his voice steady. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. The general studied his face, searching for recognition, but before he could respond, the young man continued. "You led the mission that took my father." The crowd fell silent. Even the officers around them froze. The general's breath hitched. He had led many operations, made decisions that altered lives in ways he couldn't always control. He had never questioned his duty, but now, standing here, stripped of his rank and authority in the eyes of the very system he had served, he saw himself through a different lens. The pain in the young man's eyes wasn't just about the past, it was about justice, about the kind of power that had been wielded over him, just as it had been over the general tonight. The officer who had sprayed the gas finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." The general turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "Neither did I," he said quietly. The weight of those words lingered, cutting through the noise. And just like that, the story wasn't about a single moment of injustice anymore. It was about cycles of power, of assumptions, of consequences that reach far beyond this night. No one walked away unchanged. Not the officer, not the young man, not even the general. The street felt different now. The shouting had died down, replaced by something quieter, an unspoken understanding, a moment where everything had shifted. The officer, once so sure of his actions, now stood with his head slightly lowered, as if the weight of what had happened had finally settled on his shoulders. The general, still composed but undeniably changed, exhaled slowly. The young man who had spoken didn't say anything else. He just looked at the general, his expression caught somewhere between anger and something more complicated. Recognition, maybe, that justice wasn't always as simple as revenge or blame. After a long pause, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The senior officer finally stepped in, nodding to the general. "We'll handle this," he said, his voice measured. He looked at the officer who had fired the tear gas, and without another word, led him away. There would be consequences, accountability, but not here, not now. The general stood there for a moment longer before finally walking in the opposite direction. He didn't need to say anything. The lesson had already been taught. Tonight had revealed something deeper than a single act of injustice. It had exposed the assumptions people carried, the weight of past decisions, and how quickly power could shift. And as he disappeared into the night, the world felt just a little different than it had before. James exhaled sharply, glancing around. No one was helping him. No one ever did. He had been in situations like this before, accused, cornered, made to feel small. He thought about his wife and kids waiting for him at home, the dinner he was supposed to bring back. But before the officers could push any further, a deep, commanding voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Everything stopped. The sound of the voice cut through the tension like a knife. Deputy Miller and Officer Kent froze, their hands still hovering over James' bag. Slowly they turned, and their faces paled the moment they recognized Sheriff Marcus Reynolds standing just a few feet away. "Sheriff," Miller said, straightening his posture. "Didn't see you there." Reynolds took a step closer, his gaze cold and unreadable. "I bet you didn't." James looked between them, still gripping his grocery bag. For the first time since this started, he felt like someone was on his side. Reynolds didn't take his eyes off the two officers. "Mind telling me why you're harassing a man who's just trying to buy his groceries?" Kent shifted uncomfortably. "He was acting suspicious, sir." "Suspicious?" Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "How?" The officers exchanged a look. They had no real answer, nothing solid to justify their actions. James exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wanted to speak up, to say something, but he had learned the hard way that his words often didn't matter. Reynolds, however, wasn't letting this slide. He turned to James. "Sir, do you have a receipt for your groceries?" James nodded, pulling it from his pocket with steady hands. Reynolds took it, glanced at it, then turned back to the officers. His next words were slow and deliberate. "So explain to me again why you're questioning him." Neither officer spoke. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Reynolds let the moment hang before speaking again. "You two are coming with me." Miller's face twitched. "Sir, we were just—" "I wasn't asking," Reynolds cut in. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. James watched as the officers hesitated, then reluctantly nodded. But even as they followed Reynolds toward the exit, James knew this wasn't over. Not yet. James watched as Sheriff Reynolds led the two officers toward the exit, his heart still pounding in his chest. Shoppers slowly resumed their business. The weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. He should have felt relieved, but something told him this wasn't over. Not yet. Outside, the parking lot lights cast long shadows as Reynolds stopped near his unmarked SUV. The two officers stood stiffly, their expressions tense. The sheriff folded his arms, letting the silence stretch before he finally spoke. "You think that badge gives you the right to treat people however you want." His voice was low, controlled, but laced with something dangerous. Miller cleared his throat. "Sheriff, we didn't do anything wrong. We were just doing our job." Reynolds let out a short, humorless laugh. "Your job? Harassing a man who did nothing but walk into a store and buy food. That's what you call police work?" Kent shifted uncomfortably. "We thought he was acting nervous." Reynolds' eyes darkened. "You mean he was black and shopping alone?" Neither officer answered. Reynolds took a step closer. "I've seen this before. You pick someone, make them feel small, hope they get scared enough to slip up. But this time, you picked the wrong man, and I was watching." Miller swallowed. "Sheriff, we—" "Enough." Reynolds cut him off. His voice was sharper now. "I've had my eye on both of you for a while. Complaints, reports, always just enough to slip through the cracks. But not this time." The officers glanced at each other, their unease growing. Reynolds exhaled, shaking his head. "You know, there was a time when I thought I could fix this department by giving people like you a chance to change." He stepped back, his next words slow and deliberate. "But now, I realize, some people don't deserve a badge." The tension in the air was suffocating. James had stepped outside by now, standing near his car, watching the scene unfold. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, waiting, wondering what would happen next. The sheriff took out his phone. "Both of you, hand over your badges and guns. Now." Miller's jaw tightened. "Sir, you don't have to do this." Reynolds met his gaze, unflinching. "Oh, I do. And believe me, this is just the beginning." James held his breath as the officers hesitated, their faces tight with anger and shame. The moment stretched, the weight of it pressing down on everyone. And then, the first badge hit the pavement. The metal badge hit the pavement with a sharp clink, but no one moved. The air was thick with tension as Kent stood frozen, his fingers still gripping his own badge. His jaw was tight, his face pale under the dim parking lot lights. Miller had already given in, his badge lying in the dirt between them, but Kent hesitated. Sheriff Reynolds took a step closer. "I said now." Kent's fingers twitched, his breath shallow. His eyes darted between the sheriff and Miller, then over to James, who stood by his car, watching. Something flickered in Kent's expression, something that didn't sit right.